My name is Stephanie Bracewell, and I chose Chapter 5. And the reason I chose Chapter 5 is because I would like to work with students in student housing and apartment rentals. I would love to be a marketing manager. I love to interact with people, and I do believe that everyone should know how to make a presentation or a speech. You just have to make sure that sending the right tone in an email is very important. And I've never really considered the difference that barriers can make during a speech. And also, I have finally understand how important body language and nonverbal communication can really affect a conversation or a presentation. So let's begin. Communication barriers. If you have noise, which is any kind of interference that can cause the message that you send to be different from the message that your audience understands. You can have a physical barrier, which there could be computer screens that obscure the vision, language barriers if you speak a different kind of language, or even body language barriers. You can be standing with your arms crossed or your legs crossed and you just don't seem presentable or approachable. You can have a perceptual barrier, which means that the way that the audience perceives you, which is either positive or negative. You can also have organizational barriers, which means that the book gives the example of people that are at the top of the organization don't normally talk to people at the bottom. So if you are just like a lowly beginner in the company, you wouldn't really feel like you are able to talk to the owner of the company. You also have cultural barriers, which, like I know with Mexico, they have a lot less like personal space than we do here in America. And so they could stand a lot closer than we do, or they can maintain eye contact a lot more than we can. Because normally it only takes a few seconds for us to start to feel uncomfortable if we're standing there holding the gaze of someone else. And so if you are able to overcome these barriers, that is definitely a great way to start to make a great speech. You also have nonverbal communication. As I said earlier, eye contact is a huge thing. You don't want to stand there talking to someone and you constantly look away, because it'll make the person you're speaking with seem as though you're not that interested. Tone of voice is another one. If you're standing here and you're just like, oh, I just really don't like you, your tone of voice doesn't perceive what you are actually saying. So you are saying that you actually don't like someone, but you have a cheerful way of speaking it, so it just kind of confuses the person you're speaking with. Facial expressions are another thing. If you have a look of disgust on your face, then it's going to make the audience perceive that you are either not happy or something is causing you to look like you are just not happy. Gestures and postures, like I also said, and you can see in the picture, crossing your arms, crossing your legs, can seem very standoffish. But if you're standing there and your body is open, you have an open attitude, if you use gestures, that is part of nonverbal communication. And then you can also see that most of the meaning comes across with body language. Just a little bit comes from what people are actually hearing you say. Quite a bit of it comes from your tone of voice, but most of it comes from your body language. You also have to listen actively. If you're standing there having a conversation with someone, then you have to make sure that you are listening to them, and not just listening, you have to actively listen. You have to make sure that you are not trying to think of how you're going to respond. Active listening is attentive listening that occurs when the listener focuses his or her complete attention on the speaker. So what you need to do is you listen completely to what they're saying, and then you think after they're saying, then that's when you think about what your response would be. And then if you think about it, people only listen about 125 to 250 words per minute. That's not a lot, but you actually think 1,000 to 3,000 words per minute. That's crazy. You must also choose your words carefully. You need to know what your audience expectations are. You need to choose the right type of vocabulary and try to refrain from using jargon that not everyone else would understand. You have to make sure that your audience is either expecting to learn, to be entertained, and then you need to know what the kind of vocabulary that you're using. You need to know the education of your audience. If you're standing there speaking to a bunch of elementary school students, you don't want to have the vocabulary that graduate students would know. And with jargon, I mean that you don't need to speak words that not everyone would understand unless they are in a specific type of job skills or something that they would understand. You must be concise and clear. You have to make sure that there's no clutter in how you speak. Avoid slang, because sometimes you don't want to, a lot of people don't understand it, and then also you don't want to unintentionally alienate yourself from your audience. You must also avoid bias. You don't want anything in your presentation that would throw off people because of their gender or their age. Another big bias would be race, ethnicity, and nationality. You don't want to offend anyone, because if that happens, they will not want to listen to your presentation and they will become very offended. There are different communication channels. You have memos and reports. These days, people use instant messaging and texting. You have emails, voicemail, telephone. Video conference has become a big thing in offices. You have an in-person presentation, which is where you're standing in front of an audience, and then you also have a face-to-face meeting. And you have to just know which way you want your audience to perceive you, even if you're not face-to-face. And then there's also high impact. You want to make sure that you get the right message across and how they do it. You want to break through the clutter. Make sure that you have the right tone in your message. You want to make sure that it sounds natural and not like you're reading from a book. Make sure that you use active voice, which means that you are using verbs that are speaking in now, not as in the past. Personal pronouns, make sure that you're using you and I and we. And use contractions when necessary. You don't want to say, I do not want to do this, I cannot do this. It just seems a little unnecessary at times. And you also need to think of how you are wanting your recipient to receive the message. You don't want to get a little goofy with grammar either. Grammatical errors are very distracting. As you see in my second sentence, you ain't seen this here yet. That's a little bit distracting, right? It's okay to end with a preposition as long as it sounds right. The book uses, where's this book from? That sounds right because it's true. Where is this book from? And it even says that you can begin a sentence with and or but, such as, most teens enjoy video games with a moderate level of violence, but a small vocal minority strongly advocates a more clean-cut approach. See, you were able to end it with a preposition in the first sentence, which is from, and then you can always, it's okay to begin a sentence with and or but. If you use proper grammar, it makes it a lot easier for the listener to listen and the recipient of an email or something to read. It just makes life a little bit easier for us. Blocks and bullets. And by blocks and bullets, I mean let's use block paragraphs, and you can use headings and bulleted lists. With block paragraphs, there are 3 elements that you must keep in mind. When you do a block paragraph, use single spacing, and then you double space between those paragraphs to make it seem as though it looks like a block. Do not indent the first sentence of the paragraph either, because you want, as I said, you want the paragraph to appear to be a block, and it stands out a lot more whenever you're actually reading it. Whenever you have a bulleted list and headings and bulleted lists help guide the reader. A heading is not intended to be a label, or it is a label, but not a title. Bulleted lists keep the reader interested, and it helps them look at key points, and it also helps you show next steps, similar sections, and questions. This is a hook 'em and reel 'em in, how to create and deliver successful verbal presentations. It's easier to start with either an interesting statistic, involve the audience, tell a compelling story, give a relevant metaphor or simile, ask questions that will make your audience think. So whenever you start a presentation, you can say, oh, well, 3/4 of the world have blonde hair. That is probably not true, but it's an interesting statistic. Or you can involve the audience and say, I went out and had coffee this morning and I happened to see a dog running across the road. How many of you have seen stray animals if you were doing a presentation on animals? You can also tell a compelling story about yourself or a story that you've heard. And then you can also ask questions, which is like the one that I said about the dog crossing the road. It gives something for the audience to think about before you actually get into your presentation itself. Build them up and close them down. This is about your presentation itself. The body of the presentation is what will take the most time. You use trusted sources for information, and then use expert quotations, which will increase your credibility. Start with your key points so the audience knows what to expect. So if you were doing a presentation on declawing of cats, you need to let them know that it's harmful to the cat's claws, it's not safe, they're not able to defend themselves. And then you can go in and show research of what you did to prove that it is not safe to declaw the cats. Then, whenever you are closing your presentation, go back over your key points and let the audience know, or allow them to see how your key points had fit into the body of your presentation. Then you can signify that you're about to end your presentation. You can say, for example, well, in conclusion, and then you can go on to end your presentation. And then you can allow a minute or two for possible questions if anybody in your audience seems confused or if they would just like to know more. People do tend to retain about 10% of the information from oral presentations, 35% from visual presentations, and about 65% from a combination of both. Showing is better than telling. I am one that I learn a lot easier if I am shown what to do rather than someone just telling me what to do it. If you think about it, less is more. You don't want to bombard their minds with too much information. Just don't read the slides out loud. That's when it becomes a little bit too much. You can go easy on special effects too. You're trying to give a presentation. You don't want to show people that you are able to go crazy with PowerPoint. Just don't let your slides upstage you either, because you don't want them to pay more attention to the slides than they are to what information you are actually giving them. And you got this. All you got to do is breathe. When you do a presentation, just take a few deep breaths. 10 seconds, that's all you need. Drink a little bit of water. Your throat might feel a little dry. It also helps loosen up your throat a little bit. Just keep in mind that your audience wants you to do well. They're not out to get you. If you use humor, make sure that it is appropriate and not at anyone else's expense. You could offend quite a few people that way. Just stay calm. You don't want to get too jittery, but you can use the adrenaline to help you through your presentation. Don't be afraid to take a second to consider a question if you have a hostile audience member. A lot of times they will come out and they will ask you a question and they believe that you are wrong in something that you have said. But don't be offended. They have your opinion and you have yours. Once you've answered the question, don't reestablish that eye contact with the hostile questioner. Just don't let them get to you. Another tip that you can use for dynamic delivery: practice. Know your material, but never memorize it. You can look at your audience, but don't pinpoint on someone because it could make them very uncomfortable. Vary your voice, expression, and body language. Use your hands for gestures. You can raise and lower your voice a little bit to keep them interested. You can use selective notes, like say for instance use index cards and just have a few notes to help guide you through the presentation so you're not reading just from the PowerPoint. Stick to your allotted time. If someone gives you 10 minutes for a presentation, don't go 20-30 minutes in a presentation. Also, slow down and listen to yourself. You don't want to talk too fast. You don't want to jumble over your words. You can use natural gestures, just let it flow. And practice just a little bit more, because they say that practice makes perfect, but you don't have to be perfect. So let's wrap it up. Just make sure there aren't any barriers that are giving you a disadvantage to speaking with your audience members. Nonverbal communication is very important. And be a great active listener. Always make sure that you listen to what they say before you even think about what to respond. Make sure there aren't any biases or slang in your presentation. You don't want to offend anybody. Your messages should be clear and clutter-free. You don't want to overdo it in words. Don't make grammar goofs. Make sure that everything is spelled right, that you are using the right grammar when you speak and whenever you have a written presentation. Use the right tone for the message that you're wanting to get across. If you are sending an email to an employee that you are unhappy with, make sure that it is a straight to the point message and that they aren't thinking that you were joking. Bulleted lists and headings help the reader. They group it all together and they help guide them along. Your presentation should have an opening, a body, and a closing. Just breathe. You got this. The audience isn't out to get you. And then practice what you speak. It will help. I promise. And here are my sources for when I've got my pictures.